you're limited more by your own perception of the worldview or the world than you're actually limited by the world. Hello, everyone, and welcome to MindMatters. Today is going to be Harrison and I in the studio, and we were going to be talking about cosmology, and not necessarily in the strictly astrophysics sense, but more in the kind of like metaphysical worldview. So along that line, I was reading God Exists, but God Does Not by David Ray Griffin, and it basically just kind of gives an overview of the arguments for God in the process philosophical terms, and against the fundamentalist theistic version or conception of the omnipotent deity. And it was really interesting just going through everything, but he does have a section on cosmology and cosmological order. So let's see, where was it? Talking about cosmological order, there is the argument for God against like Newton and Kant. There's evolution, teleology, and a whole bunch of good stuff, including novelty. So I guess like kind of one of the questions that I was wanting to go over was what is our place in the universe? I don't know if that's too broad.
It might be too broad for me. But before we get there, let's take a baby step towards that question. So, what do you mean by that? Like our place in the world? Well, so I guess we'd have to kind of determine who we are and what the world is. So,
well, there's life, or the way that I was kind of conceptualizing it was, the purpose of life, I guess more fundamentally would be the purpose of the universe, and then the purpose of life, and then the purpose of us as human beings, which is all kind of built upon each other. And I wasn't sure when we were going over discussing the idea for the topic for today, where we wanted to kind of start with that and go from there. Do we want to just start?
Well, I think I can get there in a roundabout way, maybe to start out with, because you mentioned the book that Griffin's arguing for like a type of theism within process philosophy, so process theism you might call it, and he's arguing against like atheist positions and against more traditional theistic belief systems. So he's presenting a certain picture of God that he thinks is philosophically cogent, that can that is composed of the argument is composed of ideas that don't contradict each other and that don't contradict actual evidence that we see in the world. So his view wouldn't contradict any scientific data that we have. It might contradict some philosophical interpretations of that data, but it's not inconsistent with science, for example. But the image that he presents, because it's based on Whitehead and it's a process philosophy, is, I don't think that Whitehead puts it in these terms, but it does go back to the old aphorism, as above, so below, the kind of hermetic ideal that there's almost there's a correlation, kind of, Genesis too, that God created man in his image, that there is it's almost like there's a fractal or holographic thing going on where the whole, all of the parts are in some sense equivalent to the whole. And so there would be some kind of equivalence between, let's say, any individual human and the totality of everything, which would be God, according to these definitions. So to understand understand either would be to understand one would be to understand something of the other. So everything that we might learn about ourselves on a fundamental level would be applicable to the whole, and then everything about the whole would be applicable on some level to the part.
Yeah, he makes a mention of there being that God being the exemplar of metaphysical rules, laws, and truth and morals. So, like you're saying, he would be the exemplar of it. So very similar to we have these things, and he just exemplifies that.
Right. So that principle will apply on all the levels, and I'll reference back our show, the interview we did with Ken Pedersen on the information system worldview, and how he's looking at the world from everything from the most basic things like information and energy up through quantum processes and subatomic particles to up through all those levels to humanity and humans and our kind of a global information network that we call our civilization and culture, and then up towards God. And so he's looking at all these different levels, and so Whitehead would go a bit further than that and point out the basic principles that are the same. Well, not only the principles, but the basic ontology or being of things that is the same from the very bottom to the very top. So I mentioned the equivalence or the comparison between an individual human and the totality and and everything. The same would apply to a subatomic process, that in its most simple terms, that all of those three things are equivalent. There's something about them that is the same across the board. And that's kind of one way of saying that everything has something in common with everything else because we're all part of the same world, the same universe. That if there was something so drastically different about something, like on the very level of being, that it's almost like such a contradiction wouldn't even be able to exist in the world. Like there has to be some kind of commonality. Not only does there have to be a space in which to interact, but something about the very nature of the stuff in that space is the same stuff. Like it's able to interact in some way. Mm-hmm. That's kind of it's probably not a totally accurate picture of the argument, but there's something also like that in his argument against like Cartesian dualism, like this idea of two totally different substances that can somehow interact. It's one of those philosophical problems that will really pretty much only exists in philosophical books like this, because no ordinary person actually like thinks about these things, but they're kind of like logical problems. Well, if this is what you're saying, well, how does and this is what you're saying, how do those ideas actually work? And it's the philosopher's job to say, well, that can't work, well, here's how to solve this problem, or if we get rid of that and rethink this, then that gets rid of the problem. That's kind of what Griffin's really good at. But so there's these similarities between everything. So one kind of roundabout way to find a generalized, or like an extremely general purpose would be to look at all of these things and find the commonalities and say, okay, well, what place do I fit into the universe that has something in common with everything else? And of course, then we can go from the most general level, which is really what philosophy tends to deal with, is the biggest generalities, down to more specific, until you come to the totally specific, which is you or me, and then even more specific, me in this precise moment, because you can have time purposes, right? Well, what's my purpose over the rest of my lifetime? What's my purpose over the next 10 years? What's my purpose over the next week? And how do I achieve that? And the way all those fit together is on this basic level of the nature of being, the nature of existence. And ontology for Whitehead is that everything is, try to really quickly sum up some of the ideas that I think we brought them up in our interview with John Buchanan, is that everything is both you could call it an I and an it. There's a subject and an object aspect to everything in the universe. So I am an experiencing, thinking, perceiving subject in this moment, at the same time that I am a sensory object for you atom. Like, so we are interacting in a way, but neither of us have total conscious access to the agency of the other. So maybe I can, but I can't experience your thoughts and what it's like to be you. Those things seem to be off limits in such a way that on a very fundamental level. Of course, if we get into psi, there's evidence that there might be some kind of leakage, and process philosophy accounts for that too. So that on some unconscious level, the subject side of myself has access to all of these streams of information, some of which is what's going on in your mind, but only the stuff that might be relevant or necessary to me might surface to conscious awareness in some manner, whether in imagery in a dream or just a feeling or a hunch or whatever. But that's one aspect, is that we have this subject and object sense to each other. And so this is part of how Whitehead tries to resolve the conflict between determinism and free will. It's that philosophy, I think he'd argue that philosophers did a great disservice to philosophy and to people in general when they got rid of the Aristotelian notion of a final cause, which is an aim or a purpose that something moves towards. So you have efficient causation, which is like physical causation, like one ball hits another and it moves. But then final causation would be, okay, so you decide to punch me in the face, and then I decide or not to move out of the way. Maybe I don't have time, but if I don't move out of the way, you then connect, and it's like one ball hitting the other. There's the efficient causation, but there is a real element of the choice involved and the agency. So for Whitehead, the agency involved, the free will, is in that mental or subject pole of the thing. It's the thing that chooses between the possible future states that can be manifested in the world, and then once that choice is made, that then kind of folds into the reality of the being that I am, and then it gets manifested. So that can be like just the movement it can be physical movement, or, well, a lot of what it is in human terms is physical movement. It's the choice. It's the things that I choose to, on some level, in some mysterious way, I choose to move my vocal cords and push air through them in such a way as to make speech that is intelligible. But it's movements, and every kind of, or the vast majority of the ways that we interact with each other are movements of our physical body. It's whether we're writing an email or moving our vocal cords or gesticulating or making facial expressions. All those are possible physical states and possible sequences of physical states that we put together in a way to be meaningful to another person or another being. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human. It can be your dog. So Whitehead, and Griffin too, because he likes Whitehead, is trying to kind of reconcile these things that these big philosophical problems that get imported into worldviews, like people who might have a staunch belief in determinism. Like a lot of scientists today don't believe there is any such thing as free will. They think it's impossible, and Griffin and Whitehead would argue, well, that's a consequence of their philosophy, which is the result of the development of philosophy over the last couple hundred years, and that it's not. It isn't. The case isn't as closed as they think it is, and it's because there are these blinders on with built into their worldview that kind of just close themselves off from that, because they say it's pretty much circular. Free will can't exist because free will doesn't exist, and free will doesn't exist because it can't exist. But neither of those propositions really makes any sense or has any justification. Just looking at, let's say, like the physical evidence. And
at the same time, too, there's the solipsistic nature of making these assertions or certain claims by, we'll say, like the scientific materialists, where they, like with mathematics, they will, when they're using mathematics, they believe that they're real. But and that's in like practical terms. But then as soon as they go back into their like study room, I guess, and they're trying to like figure things out, they're like, oh, they don't actually exist.
Yeah. What is Griffin call that? Like performative self-contradiction or something like that?
Yeah, performative contradiction.
Yeah, where you verbally express a proposition or a belief or a conviction, and at the very instant that you're doing it, you are contradicting that statement. So with free will, it's by choosing to deny free will, you are using your free will to deny it and contradicting yourself in the process and demonstrating that free will exists. It's that. I can't remember who said it first or if I came up with it, but because you often hear guys like Richard Dawkins talking like this, right? Totally deterministic, and then you say, well, then who wrote your book? It's like, you didn't. You're saying you didn't actually choose to write this book. You didn't. You had no role whatsoever in coming up with the arguments. You kind of. It's actually kind of it could be a liberating philosophy, because all of a sudden there would be no ownership of intellectual property or anything else in principle. But principles don't exist in a world that doesn't have free will. So never mind that. But it's still just funny to think about how Richard Dawkins and all these guys who like labor away at their computers composing these books and choosing to delete and choosing to change words. Well, they didn't actually choose any of that. It just came out of them. It was just their particles that just happened to move in such a way to give them the illusion that they were actually thinking.
Yeah, so there's that whole like you were saying, they didn't really, like, if what they're saying is true, they didn't actually choose to write their book. And in the same way, like, they didn't really choose to reject religion, right. Which, I mean, they make it seem like this kind of like grand conspiracy to make you subservient to the priestly class, which I think in a way can be, an argument can be made in that direction. But still, they've chosen not to. Right.
And their entire arguments are built upon the premise that they can change people's minds.
Yes.
And that their minds have been changed. Yes. They've seen reason, but really they haven't. They're not reasonable. They don't have a reason. Reason is impossible in a world without free will. So they are just this machine who has convinced itself that it's smart, essentially, that it's come to good conclusions about things, and then convinces itself that well, in this very self-contradictory way, that this machine can then convince other machines to change their minds when it's just following its own programming, and everyone else is just following their own programming, and the ones that only seem to be convinced are just it was just a mechanical reaction in their body that made them seem like they now believe something else, but they don't actually believe anything because they're just a machine and they don't actually have beliefs or are able to form thoughts or are able to reason. So it gets to this ridiculous like absurdity, just following a simple premise like that to its logical conclusion, to the point where you can't take someone who denies free will seriously because they don't take themselves seriously.
Yeah. So if we wanted to, because I don't want to spend the whole time just like, going off on these guys and just how ridiculous they are. What was the idea that you had in mind? What was the question that you were really wanting to explore?
Well, I've had an idea of, we've done it a couple times on the show, is just trying to put together a bunch of the stuff that we've been talking about into a kind of a picture. And one way of doing that we could look at with maybe some of the elements from this book is to put together some of the things that we were talking about with Peterson and with Buchanan, and then maybe probably some other shows, to kind of look at what might be some aspects of that big picture totality, like God in Griffin's word, or the cosmic mind, or the divine whatever, and then some of the things from Peterson. Well, maybe the way to get into it, I want to talk about a couple ideas from Rupert Sheldrake that he had in one of his most recent books, Science Set Free, which is actually quite a few years old now, I think, at least 5 maybe, I can't remember, 10. And it was this idea of physical laws or physical constants. Because for people without a math background, and I don't have a math background, I mean, my math is what I learned in school, but I think I have enough of a background to give the very basic ideas. Like when you have something like gravity, there is a gravitational constant. So depending on the mass of the Earth and the thing on it, so depending on those ratios, there will be a constant rate of acceleration for a body falling towards that bigger body. So on Earth, it's what,
negative 9.8, yeah.
Yeah, 9.81 meters per second squared or something like that. So, and the actual number isn't important, but there are all kinds of these physical constants that are a number that seems very precise. And there are all kinds of theories about what's going on with these numbers, why they are the way they are. There are the fine-tuning arguments or the anthropic principle arguments that say that they're the way they are because they could be any other value, and the fact that they're precise values, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, the ratios of different values together work in such a way as to seemingly make our universe possible. Like if this value were a little bit off, then it wouldn't have the precise ratio with this other value, and these electrons wouldn't be able to hold on to their atoms.
You wouldn't get more than helium.
Yeah, and everything would fall apart, and et cetera, et cetera. So some of those people argue, okay, well, basically there must be a physical constant dial system set up in the holy temple up there, and God precisely chooses all of those precise values to make it all work, essentially. And then there are others that say, well, there are some assumptions built into that because we don't know, constants are still a bit of a mystery. So one of the things that Sheldrake talks about in this book, which I found really interesting, was some actual experiments. So
what was the book?
Science Set Free is I can't remember if The Science Delusion is is its English title. Yeah, I think Science Set Free was its UK title. But he talks about some experiments in measuring gravity, I think, and how with more and more precise measuring capability, they're basically able to narrow it down to a very large number to a very large number of decimal points, basically. So more and more precise. But if I remember correctly, what he's saying is that some of these results look like it may not be as constant as we think it is, and there are a few possibilities to explain this phenomenon. It could be that it is a very precise value, but for whatever reason, the instruments just can't necessarily be that accurate to get that one precise value. It could be that the values are, I think he put it being stochastic in nature. So there's basically a set of values clustering around this tiny or this very precise number, and it just kind of will randomly choose between them. So you measure at one time, it might be a tiny bit lower or a tiny bit higher than it actually, or than it was beforehand. So the constant might actually be kind of hovering around this,
like an electron in an electron cloud.
Maybe kind of like that, or like a fly caught in a jar. It's moving all over the place, right? But there are certain bounds that it can't get out of. So I guess kind of like an electron too, or it could be maybe a combination of them, but I think maybe the third option or a third option would be that the values can change over time, so they're not constant. So maybe not only are they not precisely constant at one specific value, but they might be randomly flit about in this small number of values, but it might actually change over time as well. So gravity now might not be the same as it was billions of years ago. That value might have kind of been a convergence of something, and this is actually an idea that Whitehead proposes too. That so in his system, this is the way it kind of has to be. That the physical constants that we have are only constant. Well, they're not constants. They're not laws, as he says. They are habits, and so I think this is why Sheldrake likes Whitehead too, is because Whitehead talked about the habits of nature. There are no laws of nature, at least not not in reference to the specific laws that we think about or that he's referring to. There are habits of nature. So there is a habitual gravitational constant, in the sense that over time, matter has learned to converge on that value for whatever reason. Somehow so it could have been vastly different. And this actually might work with a fine-tuning argument too, where you have these very basic energetic, material things that have all of these possible behaviors. I'm gonna purposefully use animal or living thing descriptors and verbs. So you have all of these behaviors, possible behaviors, and as the universe progressed and evolved, it was kind of like they might. I'm leaving out something important that I'll get to, but how exactly this change happens and how exactly that's even possible. But leaving that aside for the moment, you have all of these things with possible behaviors, and it's as if, kind of like a mouse learning a maze, all of these bits of energetic matter kind of learn to approach the values that then produce the most harmonious full picture. So it's not like God is up in the sky turning the dials and saying, okay, that's the one, let it go. It's in Whitehead's view, there's an initial chaos where nothing makes sense, nothing is ordered, and slowly out of that chaos emerges that harmonic order where things work together. So there are no divinely ordained physical constants or laws. They are the end result. They are the habits that result from the choices and decisions and feelings of the basic material stuff. And how that ties in with process theology is that one of the main roles for God in this philosophy is to provide what Whitehead calls the initial aim. And this is something that John Buchanan brought up in our show, this idea of an initial aim. I'm pretty sure he brought it up. And that is, so if the world isn't deterministic, strictly deterministic, where everything can only do one thing, and everything just plays out, you can move it forward or back, like the slider on your video on the, when you've got QuickTime open, and it'll play out totally the same forward and back, and there's that one possibility, and it just inexorably just is what it is. It seems that quantum physics kind of has opened up that picture to at least the point where, there are moments of indeterminacy where you don't know what is going to happen next. It could be this, or it could be that, or it could be that. And so there's so all of a sudden that picture gets broken up into countless tiny frames where each one is branching. Well, this could go here, here, here. Okay, but it went here. So now here, here, here. And so you get, all of a sudden you get a video file that could be completely different depending on which iteration you take. So it's not this strictly determinist thing. But then, Whitehead goes a bit further and says, well, it's not even that. It's not just that there's indeterminacy, because even indeterminacy doesn't necessarily need a conscious choice or even an unconscious choice. It could just be random. It's like you just flip the dice and then it says, okay, not this one, not this one, this one. This one, this one, this one, this one. Mm-hmm. So there's there's not necessarily any room for freedom or free will in just looking at in some interpretations of quantum theory. So what you now have is at least the possibility of it. And so the question then becomes, well, then where does the impetus or the what's the word? Where does that
the novelty?
Kind of. Where does the charge or the weight for one choice over another come from? Novelty has something to do with it, but that's what the initial aim is. Here is I think according to Whitehead, it's basically, here is the best option available for you given everything about you and about the universe right now. And that basically enters into the being in that moment of becoming, that moment of like prior to manifestation, as everything comes together and gets, data processed and then determines what the next state will be. Whether my hand moves here or here, whether I choose this job or that job, whether some quantum process goes this way or that way, that there is an initial aim that is presented to that being to produce the best thing possible. And then, in the case of humans who have more free will than protons, it gets more complicated because we don't just have full and total access to that initial aim. It's not it's not deterministic in the sense that, oh, here's the aim and then I just follow it like a robot and all of a sudden the world is the best place possible because I've made the best decision. There are all kinds of factors that are affecting how I will choose. There's my entire past that might have set me up habitually. I might have developed a habit that makes me totally blind to that best option. So I might miss an opportunity because of the choices I've made and the circumstances that have happened to me. So at least that's one aspect of my understanding of this initial aim. It is that there has to be something in this worldview where there is free will that provides the options available to you, because presumably if there were a lot of options, there's nothing that logically that says you have to be aware of those options. There can be all kinds of options and the world can still play out deterministically along one track, so you just have that one movie, right? There are all these other options, but I have no access to them, so I just do the one thing that I can do, and the universe plays out like that deterministic block, that unchangeable movie back and forth. So there has to be a way of accessing those possibilities, of actually prehending them, as Whitehead puts it, of actually grasping them with your consciousness in some way. And so that's one of these aspects that gets brought into this picture, is that not only do these possibilities have to exist in some way, because they don't exist like atoms exist or like physical objects, because possibilities are by nature and by definition not material things. So they have to exist in some way. Then we have to have access to them. We have to be able to interact with them in such a way as to make them effective in the world. If they have to be able to do something in the world, they have to be able to act on a person or a thing. Because if there's a possibility for me to do something and it has no way of entering into my being and my consciousness in some way, I won't do that thing because it's not part of my world. So right away there's an ontology. There's the nature of existence. How do possibilities exist in the world? And there has to be a perceptual apparatus. How do beings perceive those possibilities? How is that possible? Both of those things are impossible, by the way, under the materialistic worldview. Possibilities can't possibly exist because the only thing that exists is non-material by definition. And so possibilities all of a sudden don't exist, and then the perception of those possibilities must be impossible because, first of all, non-physical things don't exist, and therefore, and also, there's no possible way of perceiving non-physical things because non-physical things don't exist. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, again, we could take that to the level of absurdity where you have no access to other possibilities. So Richard Dawkins, writing his book, has, when he uses the wrong word and he's going over and revising, he has no possibility of recognizing that he's lost the other word because he can't even perceive the possibility that he has put the wrong word in there or he's made a typo. There needs to be an element of freedom in order to compare one thing to any other thing. And that's really what most mentation and cognition comes down to, is some form of comparison. So, I'll just get into one other way of thinking about this. This gets back to something that Jordan Peterson often talked about in his lectures, especially in his debates with Sam Harris about the nature of facts and values. So one of the points that Peterson made is that, it's been so long since I listened to those, I'll probably get it wrong, but I think his argument was something like, well, whenever you're looking at facts, in order to even create a worldview based on facts, you have to have a way of identifying the facts, of excluding everything that isn't the fact. And in order to do that, you need to import value. Values, so, because Harris was saying you can derive, or you can, something like you can derive values from facts. You can start with facts and then get values out of them. And Peterson is saying, no, actually, values have to come first, because you need to value the fact over the non-fact in order to even identify the fact in the first place. And so this too is kind of a general principle that, just like earlier, as above, so below, it's a general principle that seems to have to apply to everything, to every level of creation, and to every process, every mental process, every emotional process, everything that you can possibly think of. This needs to be somehow fundamentally underpinning all of that. And it is this notion of importance. This is, I just started reading a while ago, another one of Whitehead's books, the Modes of Thought, I think it is, where he has the section devoted to importance. He's like, well, he doesn't put it this way, but he basically says importance is the most important philosophical topic, because you don't often think about it, but when you do, you realize, okay, well, yes, because think about perception.
It's the only, well, like you were saying, it's the only way of determining what is and what isn't, is what's important. I mean, it's so foundationally built into everything that there's no way of getting around it. In order to structure this thought that I'm speaking right now, is because it is an important one. Well, why is it important? Well, because of the conversation we were just having, and so on. So it really, wow, yeah.
And it's important on so many more levels than that, because even in the very act of speaking, there's an importance to the next syllable that you're going to pronounce, of course, the next phrase that you're going to make, to the tone of your voice, the volume of your voice. Everything, there is value inherent in every process, every part of that process, from the most long term to the most short term. And all of that will have to be in mind, because you have to keep in mind that depending on what you say to me, that could affect our interactions and our relationships for the rest of our lives, right? You could say something that is completely inappropriate or whatever. So that, on some level, you're thinking about that when you're speaking to anyone. There is so that's almost like a regulatory mechanism that's working on your speech at all time. Is that, okay, what are the bounds of what I can say? And then what are the specifics that I want to say in this moment? And then you have to form your thoughts down to the kind of microsecond. None of this goes on consciously, or at least very little of it goes on consciously. It's a lot of these are unconscious choices that are being made, but they are choices because at every instant,
there's a difference or a different thing that you can make, and a different angle you can take, a different way of inflecting your voice, like you were saying before.
Yeah, exactly. So Peterson gives the example of facts and how values are essential for even selecting the facts. But another example where and we were just talking about speech, a third example is even just perception and attention, because in order to, and Peterson talks about this too, about the studies when they were, or the early forays into artificial intelligence and trying to reproduce visual perception using AI, and them finding that even with a picture with like clearly defined shapes, the AI would just perceive it as just kind of random noise, because there's all kinds of stuff that's going on before you even perceive what you think is just happening instantaneously. There's all kinds of processing and previous iterations of experience that have formed habits of perception for you to then recognize everything in this space, in the space of your vision and your perceptual field. And inherent in all of that is value too. So the point Peterson makes is that when you're looking at everything, you're not seeing the object, you're seeing its value. So you're seeing a chair because you know that chairs are useful, they do these things. Like everything that you see, you have differentiated from everything else because it plays a different role in your life. And so some things are neutral, some things are highly sought after, things that you want for yourself or that are good. So of course, food and things like that. And then there are the things that are bad that have a very negative emotional valence for you that you want to avoid. But everything that you see, everything that you perceive, the reason you perceive it is because you're differentiating it from everything else. You're saying that thing is that thing, not all those other things. And that applies to everything that you see. You wouldn't see anything if you didn't have any of that data and all of that, any of those data points to compare to. So when you're perceiving, there has to be, importance comes into it. Even where you focus your attention, the point at which you look, there is something inherently more important about it to you at that moment. Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking at it. The two are just are inextricably linked. Your attention is actually you directing your consciousness, your mind, your perception to something that you find important, that is important to you for some reason, and that is essential to everything, to being. So this comes back to, sorry, I got an itchy nose.
But this comes back to the initial aim from the cosmic mind, giving you that initial value of, what is good in that particular instance or in that particular mode, or even at the very beginning of things, when it set the whole into motion, we could say.
Yeah. Yeah. So it not only provides the very notion of importance, but the very notion of importance, the most important thing for you in your context at that moment, and then all of the other important things for all other reasons. Because one thing it's just another way of saying that in any given moment, this would be, I guess, a basic premise or a basic axiom of this way of thinking, is that at any given moment, there is a best choice that you can make. Just like, if you're doing target practice with a bow and arrow, at any given moment and on any given shot, there's a best result that you can get. And that's a perfect bullseye. And then there are all the other possibilities. There's everything that can distract you or cause you not to get that, whether it's a lack of practice and just a relative lack of ability, or how do they put it in nurture rule, like wind distraction,
Well, I can't remember what the other one is.
Two other ones, but there are all those things that distract you from that initial aim. And of course, the initial aim doesn't have to be the bullseye. You could be aiming for something else. So it's not cut and dried. It's very hard to create a cut and dried kind of ethic out of this. So for instance, it's not necessarily the case that you can create, or it's not necessarily the case that it's possible to create a religious or a philosophical system or a spirituality that says these are all the rules, right? So Here are the things you have to do in your life, and that's the initial aim, basically. That's the best thing you can do possible in all situations, no exceptions. That's kind of impossible in this worldview. But what would be possible is kind of more generalities. So in these types of situations, this might be the best response. Unless this is the case, in which case this would be a better response, and it just keeps on going infinitely until you get to that one specific moment and you have the one thing that is the best thing that you can do. Now, the grace of the situation, to bring it back to a theological perspective, is that possibility is there, that it is possibility to know the right thing to do. The struggle is to be able to find it, or to be able to know it. And I think that's what would tie this kind of abstract philosophy down to the things that we've been talking about in shows on spiritual systems, is that all of these spiritual practices or systems or experiences would have the goal towards making that possible. So in Christianity, in early Christianity, we talked, I think we did those couple shows on Tim Ashworth and his book, Paul's Necessary Sin. So in in the Apostle Paul, in the letters of Paul's in the New Testament, he called this, translated literally, faith's heard thing. So when you a primary element of faith is to be able to hear the word of God and to then put it into action, and to have trust in that word as being true. And of course, like we mentioned in those shows, there's all kinds of aspects that we can talk about in relation to what Paul meant by prophecy and what it meant to hear faith's heard thing, and what it meant to respond to that. Because implicit in the concept of faith's heard thing, the thing you hear with faith, is the idea that you will then be able to put it into action and actually do it. But this is kind of what we're talking about, where the faith's heard thing would be the truth. It's simply the truth, but it might be the truth about a situation. But implicit in that truth would be what to do about it. What are your options? And to be able to see those things so that you could then make the right choice. And this ties back into our discussions of Stoic philosophy, and how the Stoic sage is the one who knows what to do in every given moment, because he is virtuous, because he has essentially trained himself to be able to recognize the situation, like discern the truth of it, and because he knows himself and knows his place in the world, know what is possible, and then know what he wants to do, and then do it. And the way Gurdjieff would put it would be to not be able to do anything that's not in your understanding. So if you understand something, that means that this is like the exoteric, mesoteric, eso or exo, whichever one I forgot, levels, is that on the esoteric level and mesoteric levels, he was saying, but that's just jargon, you don't need to know about that, is that what the person on a high level understands, they're not able to act against their understanding. That's pretty much a perfect definition of a Stoic sage. It's the perfect definition of an adult in Christ, or an elder in Christ, or one of the perfect in early Christianity. It's to be able to clearly hear the message, right? Hear the cosmic signal that's coming down to you of, oh, well, actually, first of all, there is a scale, a hierarchy, a range of possible options in any given moment. Like you can see in quantum theory, for instance, in subatomic processes, where there are all these possible states or things that can happen. There is a range of possibilities. Okay, great. But I'm not totally lost, because those don't all have equal value. And they don't all have equal value in two ways. One, because of the value that they have acquired for me and that I have given them. And two, because there actually is an order in the universe. There is an objective measure of order and harmony that I can either be in harmony with or out of harmony with. And I have the ability, at least theoretically, at least theoretically at some moment, and the promise is there that it is possible to achieve in actuality, to then hear that. And an analogy just came to mind is music, is that when you're playing music, when you're playing a violin or singing, you have the possibility of being off key, right? You can be sharp, or you can be flat, or you can just totally hit the wrong note. But if you're tone deaf, then you can't tell, right? But the analogy here is that we have the ability not only to sing all of these different microtones and to be sharp and to flat, but we have the ability to potentially hear when we are out of tune.
And then correct it, so that way we can actually hit whatever note it is that we're actually striving for in order to make, in order to perform a song that, we know and are performing, or are trying to, create on our own and, have in our minds, and are trying to bring it forward. Yeah. Okay.
And there will be like a grand song, right? A symphony, which is the universe and the entire cosmological history of the universe. And that the playing out of that universe is like the playing out of that melody and that orchestra. It starts out chaotic and there's not much music to it, but slowly it kind of establishes maybe like a harmonic overtone series, where that would be like the physical constants, where it's like, okay, now you have this set structure. And now within that structure, which is the very basic building blocks of matter that determine what subatomic particles do, what atoms do, how they combine to molecules and whatever. Once you have that structure, that possibility, that framework, now you have all of the possibilities for the different notes, and the different notes are the things that, the beings that are then composed of that matter that can then make choices and learn things and express possibilities that are inherent in the mind of God, in the cosmic mind, that then get brought into reality to be experienced for each thing's self, to then learn and to, because now you have all these notes, but now they're still not playing in harmony. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But so the whole play of creation would be like with the goal of achieving a harmonious whole. You know. So
that actually got me thinking about an orchestra, where you have each individual and their respective either instrument or voice, and so they can, like you were saying, there's certain, not necessarily like laws per se, but kind of like frameworks that they work within, and they can be sharp or flat, and then they can work towards being better at that, and then. So each individual person is, say like playing the violin, like you were saying, and then you can combine them with, the trombone or the cello, and then now you can have something that's not an order of magnitude, but something that's just more complex. Like I can't remember. A novel. What was the word that he used for when the different organelles come together to make a cell, and the cell can act very differently than all the things that it composes. It's a new, actual occasion of experience, but it's
like a higher order. It's higher order. It's a new occasion. It's Sheldrake would call it a holon, or it's not his word, but he uses it sometimes.
So you have all these individual people, and they're all able to come together to create this new thing, which is the orchestra, which is able to play this infinitely more complex piece of music that has all this greater meaning to it, and it can affect in an even greater way. So like with all of these different like the gravitational constant and electromagnetism, the strong force, weak force, and gravity, there's certain constraints therein. And then all of these other, I think he said there were 26 specific constants within like the fine-tuning argument, that if they weren't as they were, then things wouldn't be possible. Yeah. And so they're all kind of built together to create the possibility for life, which then life can come together to form like an ecosystem. And the ecosystem can come together to form or to allow for greater or more novel occasions of life. So like humans, and then humans are able to, do things above and beyond what animals were able to do. And they can come together in a group like a family and create something on another level that's more than the sum of its parts in this really interesting and cool way.
Yeah. So you started out asking, what is our place, right? Or something like that.
Something like that,
what is our place in the universe? How do we fit into it? And that's like in the amount of time that we've had, that's kind of as close as I think that I can get, is that we're a part of this universe, and there are certain possibilities inherent in that and limitations too. So because we're limited out of we're limited by the nature of our being. So certain things are possible and certain things aren't possible, but coming to know what those possibilities are through an examination of nature, and it could be anything from physics to chemistry to biochemistry to animal behaviors and animal psychology and human psychology. There's no matter what aspect of the universe you look at and study, there will be something that you can learn from it, and that will be then applicable to informing not only your worldview, but even your view of yourself and how you fit into the universe. To know what, like, because you can learn something by knowing what you are composed of, and what limitations that does place on you, or only seem to place on you. Because there is always the possibility for novelty and for new things, and for for the impossible in some ways, not
the miraculous.
Yeah, for the miraculous. To speak. I'll just say yeah, the miraculous. And what I had in mind is something like, I think it was about like the free will and determinism. How you can kind of you can get an idea, you can think you have an idea of what your limitations are, until you realize that your idea of what the limitations are were based on a faulty premise. So you actually aren't limited in those ways that you thought you were, and that the possibilities are open. And that's probably the case more often than not. The limitations are really not like the very fundamental limitations aren't really that limited, because you are a something that has access to the entire world of information and data that you then form, and which then contributes to your choices that you make in the world. And that's kind of like the most limited way you can, or the least limited way you can look at it, most or least or both. Like that's the limitation, is that you are something that takes in information and then does something with it.
Mm-hmm. And so you are limited, more, like along with what you were saying, you're limited more by your own perception of the worldview, mm-hmm. Or the world, than you're actually limited by the world.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
But what I think what Griffin, and Whitehead say is that one of the big limitations on us is that habits are strong. So not mm-hmm. only in personal, like emotional habits and behavioral habits, but like the habit of physical matter is so strong. It's like that's why that may be why we don't have X-Men superpowers where we can just change our DNA at will and just and shape shift and do all these kind of things, is because matter has a memory, it has a habit, it wants to behave in the way it does, and that's why it habitually does so. But that's not to say that it always does so, and that anomalies aren't possible. So, just as a caveat.
So it could be possible.
Yes, superpowers might be possible.
Might be possible. Ooh, I wonder. I don't know. All right. I think that's going to do it for us today. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned a few things and enjoyed this discussion. Yeah,
we'll be back with our regular people sometime soon, I think, right?
Eventually.
Yes, it'll be me and Adam next week too, and then Corey should be back, and then Ilan should be back after that. So hang on for your favorite people until then.
Are you saying I'm not their favorite people?
Well, I'm saying we're not their favorite people, or if we're not their favorite people, then they'll be satisfied in the upcoming weeks.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share around the social media sphere. In the meantime, y'all have a good weekend, good week, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.